The boardroom on the 14th floor of Vauxhall House had a view of half of London, and Greta Sallow understood, the moment she saw who was sitting around the table, that the view was the only thing in the room she was meant to leave with. Her uncle Lionel sat at the head of it. He had her grandfather's chair now, the great old leather thing that had come down from the founding of Sallow and Hart, the firm that had set diamonds for 3 generations of the country's wealthy and titled, and he sat in it with the comfortable spread of a man who has wanted something for a very long time and has finally got it. To his right, the family solicitor. To his left, Greta's cousin Marcus, in a suit too sharp for grief, already wearing the expression of an heir. And down the long table, the senior partners of Sallow and Hart, every one of whom had known Greta since she was a child running between the workbenches in the old Hatton Garden workshop, and not one of whom would meet her eye. "Greta," Lionel said, warmly, dreadfully. "Sit, sit. We've a great deal to get through, and most of it I'm afraid you won't enjoy." She did not sit. Her grandfather had been dead 11 days. Augustus Sallow, who had built the house from a single bench into a name that meant something, who had taught Greta to tell a real stone from a brilliant fake before she was 10 years old, who had said to her, more than once in the last years, with his hand over hers, "You, my girl, are the only one of them who understands what we actually do here." He had been buried on a gray Tuesday, and now, 11 days later, his only son had called a board meeting to read what came next. "The chairmanship of Sallow and Hart," Lionel said, not waiting for her to sit after all, "passes to me as is right. Marcus takes the role of creative director." A nod to the solicitor who slid papers across the polished wood. "The Hatton Garden premises, the vaults, the client book, the controlling shares, all settled, all in order, all witnessed by my father in sound mind." He let that last phrase sit in the air a moment, because everyone in the room knew it was the phrase that mattered, the phrase that would survive any challenge. Augustus made his wishes very clear. "Did he?" Greta said. It was not really a question, and Lionel chose not to hear it as one. "He did. As for you," and here the warmth in his voice thickened into something Greta recognized, the particular sweetness powerful men use when they are enjoying themselves, "my father knew your sentiments, your attachment to the old work, so he left you something he felt suited you." The solicitor produced from a soft cloth a single object and set it on the table in front of her with a small ceremonial flourish. "The key to the Cragmore workings, and the deed to the land that goes with it, 40 acres of moor in the Pennines and a hole in the ground." Marcus laughed. He did not even try to disguise it. One or two of the partners managed not to. Greta looked at the key. It was old iron, heavy, black with age, the kind of key that fits a lock no modern locksmith makes. She knew what it was. Everyone in the family knew the story of Cragmore, the way families know the embarrassing legends of their founding. Augustus Sallow's own grandfather had bought a worked-out lead and fluorspar mine in the High Pennines a century ago, on the strength of a rumor that there was something better in the rock, and had spent a fortune proving there was not, and had sealed the adit and never spoken of it again. Cragmore was the Sallow folly, a worked-out hole in a cold moor, worth nothing, costing a few pounds a year in moorland rates that nobody had ever bothered to stop paying. Augustus had left his granddaughter a family joke with an iron key tied to it. "He left me the mine," Greta said. "He left you Cragmore," Lionel agreed pleasantly. "Sentiment, I expect. You were always wandering off to look at rocks when you should have been learning the trade." He folded his hands. "Now, there's a non-compete I'll need you to sign and an agreement regarding the use of the family name, and then I think we can let you get on. You understand, Greta, the firm needs to modernize. There's no place in it now for the old ways." She signed nothing that day. She took the key and the deed, and she left the 14th floor of Vauxhall House, and she did not let a single one of them see her face change until she was alone in the lift going down. That evening, in the small flat above a closed shop in Clerkenwell that was all she had to her name now, Greta Sallow read, for the third time, the letter her grandfather had left her. It had not come through the solicitor. Augustus had given it to her himself 6 weeks before he died, when his hands had gone too unsteady to hold a loop, and he had taken to sitting in the back of the old workshop watching Greta do the close work he could no longer manage. He had pressed it into her hand and said, "Not now. When Lionel's finished. When they've given you the scraps and think it's done. Then you read it, and not before." She had thought it was the wandering of an ill old man. She understood now that Augustus Sallow, who had built an empire on knowing the difference between what a thing looked like and what a thing was, had understood his own son completely, and had planned accordingly. The letter was short. "My Greta," it said, "they will have given you Cragmore," and laughed. Good. I needed them to laugh, because a thing nobody wants is the only thing nobody guards. Lionel thinks he knows what is in that hill, which is nothing, because his grandfather told everyone it was nothing, and I let the story stand for 60 years. You know better than anyone alive that I never let a story stand unless it served me. Go to Cragmore. The key opens the upper attic. Then go down to where the old workings meet the new, and look at the rock the way I taught you to look. Not the way they taught you in your fine university, the way I taught you at the bench. What is in that hill is worth more than Vauxhall House and the whole firm together, and there is only one person alive who can prove what it is. That is why it is yours. Trust the stone, my girl. It does not lie, even when everyone holding it does." Greta read it, and set it down, and looked at the iron key in the lamplight for a long time. The thing that Lionel Sallow had never bothered to understand about his niece, the thing the whole laughing boardroom had got wrong, was that Greta was not the sentimental one who wandered off to look at rocks instead of learning the trade. She had learned the trade. She had set stones at that bench from the age of 9. But she had also done the thing none of the rest of them had ever troubled to do. She had gone away and learned what the stones actually were. She held a doctorate in economic geology, with a specialism in gem deposits and the geology of diamond-bearing formations, and she had spent 6 years, before she came home to the firm, working for an international diamond authority. The kind of body that certifies where a stone comes from, that can read in the trace chemistry and the inclusions and the very crystal structure of a diamond the story of the rock that made it. She could look at a stone and tell you, often, not just whether it was real but where on earth it had been born. It was an unfashionable expertise in a house that bought finished stones from dealers and set them in pretty things. Lionel thought it useless. Augustus had not. And the reason Augustus had not, Greta began to understand over the days that followed, had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the thing that had been quietly poisoning Sallow and Hart from the inside for years. A thing she had glimpsed at the edges of and never been able to prove, because the proof was always held by the people the proof would destroy. Because 3 days after the boardroom, the first of the letters arrived. It came on heavy paper from a firm called Meridian Stone Holdings, which Greta knew everyone in the trade knew as the great supplier that had become, over the last decade, Sallow and Hart's single largest source of loose diamonds. The letter was, on its surface, a courtesy. Meridian had heard, it said, of her grandfather's passing, and of the small bequest of the Cragmore land to Miss Sallow. They wished to express their condolences. And they wished, in the same breath, to make her an offer. Meridian Stone Holdings would be glad to purchase the Cragmore land and workings outright, at a price the letter described as generous given the property's negligible commercial value, to add to their portfolio of heritage extraction sites. They hoped she would find it convenient to sell quickly, and enclosed papers ready for her signature. Greta read it twice, and on the second reading she felt the cold start at the back of her neck, the cold that had always come since she was a child, when a stone in her hand was not what it claimed to be. A diamond supplier, the largest in the country, did not write personal condolence letters to the disinherited granddaughter of a client. A diamond supplier did not offer a generous price for a worked-out lead mine on a cold moor that the letter itself described as having negligible value. Nobody pays a premium for nothing. They pay a premium for a thing they are desperate that no one else should look at closely. And the only person on earth, her grandfather had said, could prove what was in that hill. The only person with the geology and the gemology both, the only one who could read a diamond back to the rock that bore it, was the person to whom Meridian was now writing, very politely, asking her to sell them the hill unseen and unexamined and quickly, before she ever went and looked. The shape of it began to assemble in Greta's mind, the way a flaw assembles under the loop when you finally turn the stone to the right angle. Her grandfather had not left her a folly, he had left her a question, and Meridian Stone Holdings was very, very anxious that she should not ask it. She did not answer Meridian. She let the letter sit, and she let 3 more days pass, and on the 4th morning she packed a field bag, the geologist's bag she had not touched in years, with its hammer and hand lens and sample tubes and head torch, and the iron key wrapped in a cloth at the bottom. And she got into her old car and drove north, out of London, up into the high cold country of the Pennines, to a 40-acre folly on a moor that everyone in her family agreed was worth nothing at all. Cragmore was a long gray climb at the end of an unmetalled track, and the wind came across the heather with nothing to stop it for miles. The old workings were marked, as the deed said, by a stone-lined adit driven into the hillside, its mouth blocked by a heavy timber and iron door gone gray and lichened with a century of weather. There was a newer sign wired to the fence beside it, a contractor's sign, clean and recent, warning of unstable workings and prohibiting entry, and bearing in small letters at the bottom the name Meridian Stone Holdings. Greta stood in the wind and looked at that sign for a long moment. Meridian had been here already, before her, securing the mouth of a hole they had told her was worth nothing, on land they did not yet own, on the strength of an offer she had not yet accepted. She left her car out of sight behind the ruin of the old mine office, and she walked up to the great timber door, and she took the iron key out of its cloth, and she fitted it to the ancient lock. It did not want to turn. A century of rust and weather had all but welded it. But Greta Sallow had strong hands, bench hands, her grandfather had called them, the hands of someone who works close and patient with hard small things, and she worked the key back and forth, easing it, until something deep in the mechanism gave with a groan, and the great door swung inward on darkness, and the cold breath of the hill came out to meet her, carrying a smell of wet stone and old iron and something underneath it she could not yet name. She switched on her head torch and stepped inside, into the upper adit, where the rock closed around her and the wind died to nothing, and she began to walk down into the hill her grandfather had told her held something worth more than the whole of Sallow and Hart. She had gone perhaps 200 yards, to where the old hand-cut workings opened into a wider chamber, when her torch caught, on the floor of the passage ahead, something that did not belong in a mine that had been sealed and abandoned for 100 years. Fresh footprints, more than one set, and the marks in the dust of a century of equipment that had been dragged in and set down and dragged recently back out. Greta stopped and stood very still in the dark of the hill, and understood that Meridian had not only secured the door, they had already been inside, and whatever was in here that was worth more than her family's empire, someone had been down to see it before her, and had every intention of making sure she never did. Behind her, far back up the adit, faint but unmistakable against the silence of the rock, she heard the great timber door she had left open begin, slowly, to scrape shut. The door scraped and stopped, and the dark behind Greta became absolute. She killed her head torch and stood in the black with her back to the cold wall, and she did not move, because the first thing her grandfather had ever taught her at the bench was that panic ruins more good work than any other single thing. You don't grab at a loose stone, my girl. You wait. You breathe. You let your hands go still, and then you do exactly one thing at a time. So she breathed, and she let her hands go still, and she listened. The door had not slammed. It had been pushed to slowly by someone who did not want it to bang. That told her something. A person who shuts a door quietly behind you in a dark mine is not trying to trap you with a flourish. They are trying to do it without your knowing, or without anyone outside hearing. And then, faint and far back up the attic, she heard the thing that confirmed it. A voice, low, a man speaking not to her but into a radio or a phone, the words coming down the rock distorted but legible. Her car's behind the old office. She's gone in. Doors shut. She's not coming out the front, that's certain. A pause. No, we don't touch her on the hill. Too many ways that goes wrong. Too many questions if a Sallow turns up dead on Sallow land the week she inherits it. We let the hill do it. She goes in. She has an accident in an unsafe working that's been condemned and signposted for exactly that. Tragic. The grieving granddaughter who wouldn't take advice. The voice came closer, then stopped, somewhere near the chamber mouth. We just have to know she doesn't come back up before we've moved the rest of it out. The rest of it. Greta filed that, the way she filed an inclusion she'd come back to. They were still removing something from this hill. She had walked in on the middle of a job. She had a choice, and she made it the way she made all her choices, coldly, with the part of her that did not feel anything until the work was done. She could go back up the attic toward the door and the man with the radio, and try the thing that frightened people try, which was to brazen it out, to be a woman who had every legal right to be on her own land. But she had heard the man say, "We let the hill do it," and she had heard the patience in it, and she knew that a legal right is a thing you argue in a courtroom, not a thing that helps you when you are alone underground with a person who has already decided you are going to have an accident. The front was a trap, and it was a good one, because it was the only way she was supposed to think there was. So she would not go back. She would go down, where the old workings meet the new. Her grandfather had written, "Look at the rock the way I taught you to look." There was more to this hill than the upper attic, and Augustus had wanted her deep in it, and the men removing the rest of it had to be reaching the workings from somewhere. You do not haul equipment in and out through a century-rusted door you have to fight open. There was another way in, and another way in was, by definition, another way out. She turned her torch back on, hooded against her palm so the light would not carry up the passage, and she went down into the hill. The old hand-cut workings gave way, after a few hundred yards, to the wider chamber where the footprints clustered, and here Greta slowed and read the floor the way she would have read a stone. The prints came and went in a steady traffic. The drag marks of crates or cases, something heavy, with hard square corners, carried in and out many times over what the dust told her was a period of weeks, not days. And the chamber itself had been a junction once. The old century-old workings on one side, all pick marks and timber, and on the other a more recent face, concrete shuttered, where at some point in the last decade someone had quietly driven a new passage into the hill and lined it and lit it and never told the family. Where the old workings meet the new. Augustus had known about the new passage. Of course he had. He had let the world believe Cragmore was a sealed and worthless folly for 60 years, and all that time, Greta understood now, he had been using it for something. She followed the new passage. It ran level and dry, lined in concrete, with a string of bulkhead lights along the wall, dead now, but wired ready. The drag marks ran ahead of her the whole way, and the smell she had not been able to name at the door grew stronger as she went, a sharp chemical mineral note under the wet stone cold, until the passage opened at last into a chamber that stopped her where she stood. It was a workshop, a clandestine, well-equipped workshop, cut into the heart of the hill, benches, lighting rigs gone dark, the squat shapes of machinery she recognized and machinery she did not. And on the benches, in racks, in open cases left mid-removal, were diamonds. Not a mine, not a vein of stones in the rock, a facility. Greta moved through it slowly, her hooded torch sweeping the benches, and her trained eye began to take apart what she was looking at, and the cold at the back of her neck spread until it filled her whole body, because these were not stones dug from this hill. There were no diamonds in this hill. She had known that before she ever drove north, because she was a geologist and she knew the rock of the Pennines, and there was no kimberlite within 500 miles of this moor. These stones had been brought here. And what was being done to them here, in a workshop hidden inside a folly that the whole world had been told was worthless for 100 years, was the thing that made Greta Sallow set her hand flat on a cold bench to steady herself. They were being given a past. She picked up a stone from an open tray and turned it under her loupe, and read it the way the International Authority had spent 6 years teaching her to read it: the inclusions, the trace chemistry, the tiny telltale signatures locked in the crystal that say, to someone who can read them, where on earth a diamond was born. And this stone lied. Its paperwork, there was paperwork, a certificate clipped to the tray, on Meridian Stone Holdings letterhead, said it was a natural stone from a named, legitimate, ethically certified source. But the stone itself, under Greta's loupe, was not that at all. It was a synthetic, laboratory-grown being processed, here, with the equipment on these benches, to disguise its origin. Laser-inscribed with false certification, sealed into a chain of forged provenance documents, given the manufactured history of a natural, ethically mined stone so that it could be sold, through a respectable old house with an unimpeachable name, at the price of the real thing. And on the next bench, worse. Stones that were natural but whose certificates told a careful lie about where they came from, sources scrubbed and rewritten, the geography of conflict and sanction laundered into the clean geography of the trade, so that stones nobody could legally sell became stones anybody would buy. This was not a diamond mine, it was a provenance laundry. A factory for manufacturing the one thing in the diamond trade that cannot be faked at the bench in a backroom: origin. And the only reason it worked, the only reason any of it had ever worked, was that the laundered stones flowed out of this hill and into the trade through a house whose name was a guarantee: Sallow and Hart. 3 generations of trust, a name that meant a stone was what it said it was. Meridian supplied the stones, Cragmore gave them their false history. And Sallow and Hart, Greta understood it now, completely, the whole rotten architecture of it standing clear in her mind under the loupe light. Sallow and Hart sold them to the titled and the wealthy of the country with its 3-generation guarantee, and took its cut, and asked no questions, because the man at the head of it had stopped being the kind of man who asks. Lionel. Her grandfather had known. That was what this was. That was the thing Augustus Sallow had spent the last years of his life unable to prove and unable to stop, because the proof was held inside the conspiracy, and the conspiracy ran through his own son, and an old man dying cannot fight a supplier and his own heir and the silence of partners who profit from not knowing. So Augustus had done the only thing left to a man who could not win in the open. He had not exposed it himself. He had gathered it, and he had hidden the gathering of it in the one place his son and Meridian were certain held nothing, and he had left the key to it to the one person alive who could walk into this chamber and read, in the stones themselves, the entire shape of the crime. Greta found his evidence in the back of the chamber, in a steel cabinet set into the rock, because of course he had. The same iron key did not open it, but the combination did: 6 digits, her own birthday, in the stubborn old style he'd used for every lock he ever set. Inside was a record 2 years in the making, Augustus's own notes, photographs of this chamber, samples of laundered stones in labeled cases, each with its forged Meridian certificate clipped beside Augustus's own true assay, shipping records he had somehow obtained, tracing stones from Meridian into Cragmore and out into the Sallow and Hart inventory. And the thing that made Greta's breath stop: correspondence, memoranda, emails printed and dated, between Lionel Sallow and the directors of Meridian Stone Holdings, in the careful language of people who know better than to be explicit, discussing volumes and margins and provenance solutions, and in one line that Augustus had underlined twice in his shaking hand, what was to be done about the old man's increasing curiosity. Her grandfather had known they were watching him. He had known, perhaps, that they would not let him live to use what he'd found. And so he had buried it here, behind a worthless folly and a family joke, and left it to a granddaughter everyone agreed was the sentimental one who wandered off to look at rocks, because she was the only one who could prove it, and because being underestimated had made her, in his son's eyes and meridians, beneath watching. Greta knelt in the cold chamber with 2 years of her grandfather's patient, frightened, brilliant work in her hands, and she understood the size of it. Not a fortune in diamonds. Something far larger and far more dangerous to the people who had laughed at her. The proof that one of the country's most trusted names had spent a decade selling lies to its clients and laundering stones that ought never to have entered the trade, and that her uncle had built his inheritance on it, and that Meridian was, this very week, hauling the evidence out of the Hill case by case before the disinherited granddaughter could ever come and look. That was the rest of it. That was what the man on the radio meant. They were not finished. They were dismantling the chamber, removing the workshop, erasing Cragmore, and the moment it was empty, Augustus's evidence and Greta's only proof would be gone, and the Hill would be exactly the worthless folly the world believed, and a respectable old house would go on selling lies under a guarantee 3 generations deep. She photographed everything. Methodically, the way she'd photographed 1,000 stones, every bench, every tray, every forged certificate beside its true assay, every page of her grandfather's record, the cabinet, the chamber, the machinery. She took a small selection, 3 laundered stones with their forged meridian papers, the originals of the most damning correspondence, a single page in her grandfather's hand. She resealed the cabinet and spun the lock. And then, because she was her grandfather's granddaughter and not her grandfather, she did the thing he would never have done, the thing his caution and his solitude had never let him do, the thing that had cost him, in the end, the chance to win. She did not decide to do it quietly. There was, in 9 days' time, the Sallow and Hart Bicentenary Valuation Gala at the great auction house on New Bond Street. The event Lionel had announced in the trade press the week of the funeral. The relaunch of the house under his chairmanship, the unveiling of its finest stones before the wealthy, the titled, the press, and every certifying authority and dealer of consequence in the country. The one room in Britain, in other words, where the provenance of a Sallow and Hart diamond was the entire point, where every stone on display would carry the house's 3-generation guarantee, and where the people who held that guarantee sacred would all be standing together in one place. Greta's grandfather had been a man who did not trust rooms. He had hidden his whole case in a hole in a hill rather than stand up in one. Greta had spent 6 years in the rooms where the world decides what a stone truly is. She knew exactly how to stand up in one. She would go to that gala, and she would bring the loop. She gathered her samples and her grandfather's papers into the field bag, killed her torch, and began to work back up the new passage toward the junction. And as she neared the old chamber, she saw, ahead, the wash of a torch beam playing across the rock, and heard a man's boots on the stone, and the patient voice again, closer now, coming down to find out why the granddaughter who had gone in the front door had not come up it. Greta Sallow pressed herself into the dark of a side working with 2 years of buried truth in the bag across her body, and went still as a set stone, and waited for the light to pass, calm and certain, and entirely finished being the one they laughed at. The torch beam came into the chamber ahead of the man who carried it, and Greta watched it from the dark of the side working, a narrow old stope, barely shoulder-wide, that the hand miners of a century ago had cut following some vein long since worked out. She had pressed herself back into it until the cold rock met her spine, and she had killed her own light, and now she did the hardest thing of all, which was to keep her breathing slow, while a man who intended her to have an accident searched the chamber 40 feet away. He was unhurried. That was the worst of it. A frightened man searches fast and badly. This one searched the way you search when you have all the time in the world and the only question is when, not whether. The beam crossed the benches, the cases, the mouth of the new passage. "I know you came down here, love," he said conversationally to the dark. "Door's the only way in or out you'd know about, so you're still in the hill." A pause, the beam swinging. "Sensible thing now is to come and have a talk. We're reasonable people. Nobody wants any trouble on a nice piece of moorland." Greta said nothing. She had learned 4 floors up in a boardroom 11 days ago that the people who tell you they are reasonable are narrating, not negotiating. They are building the story they will tell afterwards, the one where they offered and you refused, and what happened next was your own doing. Nobody wants any trouble. That sentence was not for her. It was for whoever might one day ask him what had happened to Greta Sallow's granddaughter at Cragmore. The beam came toward the sideworkings. She had perhaps 10 seconds, and she spent the first 2 of them thinking, because 2 seconds of thinking is worth more than 10 of running. The man was between her and the new passage, the lit, lined, modern way that the crates went in and out, the way that must somewhere reach the surface. She could not get past him to it. Behind her, the old stope ran back into the hill, narrow and unknown, into workings a century dead. A century dead working was a place a person could die in, lost in the dark with a failing torch. But it was also a place a man who did this for Meridian, in his clean boots with his careless confidence, would be very reluctant to follow her into, because he did not know it either, and his whole advantage was that he was calm and she was supposed to be afraid, and that advantage reversed the moment the ground became a thing neither of them could see. So she chose the dark she did not know over the man she did. She moved back into the stope, hand trailing the wall, feet finding the floor by feel, and she made one small deliberate sound as she went, a scuff, a dislodged stone, the sound a frightened person makes fleeing. The beam snapped toward it. "There you are," the man said, satisfied, and his boots came across the chamber. He had taken the bait. He thought he was chasing a panicking woman deeper into a trap. He was chasing a geologist into rock. Greta went fast now because the point of the noise had been to commit him, and now speed mattered more than silence. The stope twisted, dropped, narrowed. She kept her torch hooded to the floor, just enough to read the ground, and she read it the way she read everything for what it told her about the hill. And the hill told her as she went that she was not the first person down here in 100 years after all. The old timber sets that shored the roof had been renewed in places, new props, recent ones, set among the rotted originals. Someone had made this old stope safe enough to pass through. Recently. Why would Meridian shore up a dead working that led nowhere? Because it did not lead nowhere. Behind her, the man had reached the stope mouth and stopped. She heard him swear softly, heard the beam hesitate at the entrance. "Come on now," he called, and the conversational ease had thinned. "You don't want to go down there. That's 100 years of bad ground." He did not follow. He stood at the mouth exactly as she'd gambled, unwilling to put his clean boots into a hole he could not see the bottom of. "I'll just wait here then. You've nowhere to go. You'll come back." He was wrong, and Greta knew he was wrong because of the new timber, and she went on into the dark to prove it, faster now, her heart steady, following the renewed props the way she had once followed a vein, because someone had made this passage safe for a reason, and the reason was at the end of it. The stope bent and climbed, and then she felt it before she saw it. The air changed. The dead, still, mineral air of the deep working stirred and freshened and carried on it the cold, clean smell of the moor, heather, peat, rain coming. Ahead, around a last turn, the absolute black of the hill softened to the merest gray. Daylight. A long way up, but daylight. She came out at the end of it into a second added mouth, smaller than the great front door, set into a fold of the hillside half a mile from the first, screened by a spoil heap and a stand of stunted rowan, invisible from the track. This was Meridian's way. This was how the crates went in and out, how the workshop had been built and fed and was now being dismantled, not through the lichened ceremonial door the family knew, but through this hidden back mouth that did not appear on any deed and that her grandfather, she understood, had known about and let them believe was their secret. There was a vehicle track here, recently used, running down off the moor the back way. And there, parked at the adit mouth with its tailgate open, was a Meridian van, half loaded with the cases she had seen being carried out. The rest of it, mid-removal, abandoned for the moment by the men who had gone round to the front to deal with the inconvenient granddaughter. Greta stood in the cover of the Rowan and looked at the open van for a long moment, and the cold, clear part of her, the part that did not feel anything until the work was done, did the arithmetic. She could run. She had her photographs, her grandfather's papers, 3 laundered stones and their forged certificates in the bag across her body. That was enough. That was, by any sensible measure, more than enough. And the sensible thing was to get to her car and get off the moor and get the evidence somewhere safe before they realized she was no longer in the hill. But there was an open van full of the physical evidence they were destroying, and there was no one watching it. And Greta Sallow had spent 4 years of her life watching her grandfather lose a fight because he had only ever had enough. And enough had not been enough against a supplier and a son and the patient machinery of people richer than the truth. So she did not only run. She crossed to the van fast and low, and she did 3 things. She photographed the cases, the registration plate, the loaded interior, the hidden adit mouth with the Meridian van framed in it, the single image that proved, beyond any later denial, that Meridian Stone Holdings had been operating inside Cragmore before they had ever bought it. She took, from the nearest open case, 2 more laundered stones and their clipped certificates, enough to double her sample. And then, because they would empty this hill and erase it within the week, and she needed the chamber itself to still exist when the world came to look, she did the small, quiet thing that would cost them their schedule. She found the van's bonnet catch, lifted it, and pulled the leads from the battery, and dropped them into the heather where no one glancing would see them gone. A van that would not start was a van that could not be loaded and driven off the moor today. It bought her days. Days were what she needed. Then she ran back down the hidden track, round the shoulder of the hill, to where her own car waited behind the ruined office, while half a mile away a patient man still stood at the mouth of a dead stope, telling the dark that she had nowhere to go. She was 3 miles down the moor road, climbing into the safe gray anonymity of the dale, before she let herself breathe out properly. And when she did, it came out not as fear and not as triumph, but as something quieter and harder. The certainty of a person who has finally, after years of holding a flawed stone up to the light and being told by everyone around her that the flaw was not there, walked into the rock and found the flaw with her own hands. She drove south through the falling dark with 2 years of her grandfather's buried truth in the bag on the seat beside her, and she began, mile by mile, to plan exactly how she was going to hold it up to the light in the one room where no one would be able to look away. She did not go into hiding, because hiding is what the hunted do, and Greta needed Lionel and Meridian to keep believing she was not hunting anything at all. So 3 days after Cragmore, 3 days in which she had quietly couriered copies of everything to 2 places they would never think to look, and made a single careful telephone call to a woman in Antwerp she had once worked beside, Greta did the thing that would settle her enemies most completely. She telephoned her uncle and asked, in a small, flat, tired voice, whether she might come in and sign the papers. Lionel had her shown up to the 14th floor like a tradesman. Marcus was there because Marcus was always there now, hovering at his father's shoulder in the role of heir, and the family solicitor, and on the table the non-compete and the name-use agreement and, set apart, a fresh document she recognized at a glance. A transfer of the Cragmore land to Meridian Stone Holdings, ready for her signature, the price filled in, generous as the letter had promised. Greta, Lionel rose, all warmth, the great leather chair sighing behind him. "I'm glad you've seen sense. It's the kindest thing, you know, for everyone. A clean break." "I went up to look at it," she said. The room went very slightly still. Just a fraction, a half-beat in Lionel's smile, a flick of Marcus's eyes toward his father. To anyone who did not know what she now knew, it would have meant nothing. To Greta, watching the way her grandfather had taught her to watch, it was as good as a signed confession. "Did you?" Lionel said. "Cold place." She let herself sound defeated, wistful, a woman saying goodbye to a sentimental scrap. 40 acres of heather and a hole in a hill. I couldn't even get the door open. She gave a small, rueful laugh and watched the half-beat in Lionel's smile relax, watched the relief move through him and through Marcus behind him, the relief of men learning that the thing they feared had not happened. She couldn't even get the door open. "Granddad and his rocks," she said softly. "I don't know what he thought I'd do with it." "He was sentimental at the end," Lionel said, expansive again, generous in his victory. "We all forgive an old man that." He slid the Meridian transfer toward her. "Meridian have been very fair. Heritage sites, they call them. God knows why they want a worked-out hole, but it's their money." "Why do they want it?" Greta asked lightly, idly, the question of a woman making conversation while she finds her pen. And she watched. It was Marcus who answered too quickly, the way the second-rate always rushed to seem clever. "Tax thing. Heritage extraction relief. They buy up old workings, it offsets the—" and Lionel's hand came down on his son's forearm, just touched it, and Marcus stopped. "Their money, their reasons," Lionel said smoothly. "Sign, Greta, and you need never think about the cold north again." She looked at the transfer. She looked at her uncle, who had taken her grandfather's chair 11 days after the funeral, who had handed her a folly and a non-compete and called it kindness, who had built his whole inheritance on stones that lied and was now, gently, paternally, trying to buy back the one piece of land that could prove it, from the one person alive who could read the proof, while believing her too sentimental and too beaten and too small to ever look. And Greta did the thing that cost her the most, which was to pick up the pen. Because she had decided, driving south off the moor, that the gala was the room, and the gala was 9 days off, and the surest way to keep Meridian from emptying the hill in a panic was to let them believe the granddaughter had signed away her claim and gone quietly home. A signature on a transfer they could not register for weeks bought her the one thing she could not buy any other way, their certainty that it was over. Her grandfather had spent his life learning the difference between what a thing looked like and what a thing was. She could let a signature look like surrender for 9 days. She signed. Lionel beamed, Marcus exhaled. The solicitor gathered the papers, and somewhere 2 miles east in a Meridian office, a man would shortly be told that the Cragmore problem had resolved itself, and that there was no longer any urgency about the hill, and that perhaps the dismantling could proceed at a more careful pace now that the only person who might have looked had taken the money and gone. "You're doing the right thing," Lionel told her, walking her to the lift himself, a hand at her shoulder, the touch of a man being generous to someone who no longer matters. "Your grandfather would be glad you let it go." Greta stepped into the lift and turned to face him, and for just a moment, just one, she let herself look at him without the small, defeated face on. She did not say anything. She did not need to. But Lionel Sallow, who was not a stupid man, only a greedy one, frowned very slightly at something in his niece's eyes that did not match the woman who had just signed, something cool and level and entirely unafraid, and the doors closed on him before he could name what it was. He stood in the corridor a moment after she had gone, troubled by a thing he could not place. Then Marcus called him about the seating for the gala, and he forgot it, the way the comfortable always forget the thing they should have feared. Greta watched the floor numbers fall, and let the small defeated face go entirely and thought, 9 days. The woman from Antwerp arrived in London on the 7th day, and her name was Dr. Pernilla Vance, and she was, by quiet consensus within the trade, the finest origin analyst alive, a scientist who had spent 30 years reading diamonds back to the rock that bore them, and who had trained, 2 decades ago, a sharp young Englishwoman called Greta Sallow before that Englishwoman went home to set stones in pretty things for a family that did not value her. Pernilla had taken Greta's call at her bench in Antwerp, listened in silence to a great deal of it, and said at the end only, "Send me the stones." Greta had sent her 2 of the laundered stones by secure courier. Pernilla had run them through the instruments that do not care what anyone wants the answer to be, and had then booked a flight, because some things a scientist will not say down a telephone line. They met in a quiet room at a certifying laboratory in Holborn, not Sallow and Hart, not anywhere the family touched, and Pernilla laid Greta's photographs and her grandfather's records and her own fresh results across the table and looked at the younger woman for a long moment. "Your grandfather was right," she said. "Both stones are synthetic, laboratory-grown, recent, of a quality that would pass any buyer and most jewelers, because most jewelers cannot do what you and I can do. The inscriptions are forged. The certificates are forged. And the documents you photographed in that hill," she touched the printed correspondence, "if they are what they appear to be, then this is not one bad stone or one bad batch. This is a system, a decade of it, perhaps more, run through a name the whole trade trusts." She paused. "Do you understand what happens when this becomes known?" "The house falls," Greta said. "The house falls," Pernilla agreed. "And every client who ever bought a Sallow and Hart stone on the strength of that guarantee learns they may have been sold a lie. And every certifying authority in Europe has to ask how it went on so long under their noses. It will be the largest provenance scandal the trade has seen in a generation." She folded her hands. "You could take this to the regulators quietly. Let it grind through years of process behind closed doors. That is the safe way, Greta. The way that does not put you in a room with these people." "My grandfather took the safe way," Greta said. "He gathered everything and told no one and waited until he was sure, and they killed him for it, or near enough, and I'll never prove that part, and it doesn't matter. What matters is that he had the truth and he died with it still buried because he was afraid of rooms." She looked at her old teacher. "I'm not going to bury it. There's a room in 2 days where every authority and every client and every camera in the trade will be standing together, and the entire purpose of that room is the provenance of a Sallow and Hart stone. I'm going to stand up in it. Will you stand up with me?" Pernilla Vance was quiet for a moment. Then for the first time she smiled. "I taught you," she said, "to never let a stone leave the bench until you were certain. You were always my best student. Yes. I'll stand up with you." The Sallow and Hart Bicentenary Valuation Gala filled the great sale room of the auction house on New Bond Street, beneath chandeliers and the slow turning of camera flashes, and 400 people stood among the glass cases in evening dress. The titled and the wealthy who had bought from the house for 3 generations, the dealers and the auctioneers, the trade press. And because Lionel had wanted his relaunch witnessed by everyone who mattered, the directors of the certifying authorities, and in a row of seats of honor near the central case, the directors of Meridian Stone Holdings, the house's great partner and supplier, smiling the smiles of men at the launch of something they own. Lionel Sallow stood at a lectern beside the central case, in which the evening's finest stone turned slowly on its mount under a single light. A magnificent diamond, the centerpiece of the Bicentenary, certified by the house as a natural stone of impeccable and ethical origin, the very symbol of everything the Sallow name was supposed to mean. He spoke of 3 generations of trust. He spoke of his late father's legacy. He spoke, with a catch in his voice, of stewardship and modernization and the future. Greta was not on the guest list. But the granddaughter of the founder, in the plain dark suit she had worn to the funeral and the boardroom both, was not a woman the doorman of an auction house would turn away from her own family's bicentenary, and she walked in through the front while her uncle was still speaking, and she did not stop until she reached the central case, and the room, recognizing her, the press recognizing her, a ripple of whoos, that moving outward began to quiet. "Greta," Lionel said from the lectern, and the warmth was there but the eyes had gone wary, the way they had at the lift. "We're rather in the middle of "I'd like to say something about the centerpiece," Greta said. Her voice was not loud. She had learned at a bench that you do not need to be loud when you are certain. The room leans into certainty. Since it carries the house guarantee, since that's what tonight is about. A murmur. Lionel's smile held by an act of will. He could not have her removed, not here, not the founder's granddaughter, not in front of 400 people and the cameras, without making a scene that would be its own headline. Greta had calculated no good move. That was the point of the room. "My grandfather," Greta said, turning so she spoke to the 400 and not to her uncle, "taught me to read a diamond. Not to sell it, to read it. Where it was born, what it's made of, whether it is what it claims to be. It is, as it happens, what I did for 6 years before I came home with the International Authority, and it is what my colleague Dr. Pernilla Vance." Pernilla stepped forward from the crowd, and a fresh ripple went through the dealers, who knew exactly who she was, has done for 30. "And we have both examined stones supplied to this house by Meridian Stone Holdings." She let that name land, and saw, in the row of honor, a silver-haired man stop smiling. "I would invite the certifying directors present to examine, tonight, with their own instruments, the centerpiece of this gala, because I have examined 2 of its siblings, and they are not what the guarantee says they are." The room did not erupt. It did something worse. For Lionel, it went silent, the held-breath silence of 400 people who have just understood that they are present at something. "This is," Lionel's voice cracked and recovered, "this is a disgruntled relative. My niece was left out of my father's wishes and she's come to Heritage Extraction Relief," Greta said. It was so quiet and so unexpected that Lionel stopped. And across the room, in the row of honor, the silver-haired Meridian director's face changed, because he did not yet know what she had, but he knew that phrase, and he knew it should not be in this room. "Your son told me," Greta said mildly to her uncle, "in your boardroom that Meridian buys old worked-out mines for the tax relief. You stopped him before he could finish." I wondered why a tax dodge needed stopping. She set her field bag on the edge of the central case and opened it. "So I went and looked at the mine they were so generous to buy from me. Cragmore, the family folly, the worthless hole in the hill my grandfather left me as a joke." She took out the photographs and laid them one by one on the glass where the nearest guests and the nearest cameras could see. The chamber, the benches, the machinery, the laser inscriber, the trays of stones, the racks of forged Meridian certificates. "It isn't a mine. There's no diamond in that hill, and there never was. Any geologist could tell you that, which is exactly why nobody bothered. It's a workshop. For giving synthetic stones a false natural origin, and giving illegitimate stones a clean false history, and laundering both into the trade through a house whose name is a guarantee." She looked up. "Through this house, for at least a decade." She laid down the next photographs, her grandfather's records, his true assays beside the forged certificates. She laid down the printed correspondence, and she read into the silence, a single underlined line in her grandfather's hand. "What is to be done about the old man's increasing curiosity? My grandfather found this. He gathered the proof of it for 2 years in secret, because the conspiracy ran through his own son, and he could not trust anyone in this house to act on it. And he hid it in the one place his son and Meridian were certain held nothing, and he left the key to it to me, because I was the only one who could read it, and because everyone in this family had decided I was the sentimental one who wandered off to look at rocks." Her voice did not rise, but something moved through it, the first crack of feeling she had let anyone see in 9 days. "He used the fact that you all underestimated me as the lock on the safe." Then she stepped back and gestured to the central case, to the magnificent turning stone. "Don't take my word. That's the whole point. Take the instruments. Examine the centerpiece tonight here in front of everyone, and if I'm wrong, I'll have ruined myself in public and you can throw me out." "But I'm not wrong." The directors of the certifying authorities did not need to be asked twice. That was the thing Lionel had never reckoned with. that the room was full of people whose entire profession was the truth he had spent a decade selling against, and that those people, handed an open invitation in front of 400 witnesses, could not decline. The centerpiece was lifted from its mount. Pernilla Vance and 2 authority directors carried it to the loop, and the spectrometer set up at the side, and the room waited, and the cameras turned, and Lionel Sallow stood at his lectern with his bicentenary collapsing in real time around him and nowhere in the world to go. It took 11 minutes. Pernilla straightened from the instrument, and she did not shout it. She said it quietly to the directors, and the directors said it quietly to the room, and the quiet was somehow louder than any shout. The centerpiece of the Sallow and Hart Bicentenary, the symbol of 3 generations of trust, was a synthetic stone, laser inscribed with a forged inscription, sold under a forged certificate of natural and ethical origin. The room came apart. The unmaking, after, went the way these things go when they have been done in public first, and in private never. The silver-haired Meridian director was on his feet, and halfway to the doors before the cameras found him, which was its own kind of confession. Within the week, Meridian Stone Holdings was the subject of a fraud investigation that would, over the following 2 years, take the firm apart entirely. The certifying authorities suspended Sallow and Hart's standing that same night, and opened an inquiry into every stone the house had sold in a decade. The trade press had their generation-defining scandal by morning. And Lionel Sallow, who had taken his father's chair 11 days after the funeral, found that the chair, and the name, and the inheritance he had built on lies were not, after all, the kind of thing that survives a daughter of the house standing up under the chandeliers with the truth in her hands. There were charges. In time, the correspondents saw to that. Marcus, who had rushed to seem clever in a boardroom, turned on his father early and thoroughly, the moment the lawyers explained the difference between a witness and a defendant, which told Greta everything she had ever needed to know about her cousin. Greta did not stay to watch all of it. She had learned, somewhere in those long days, the difference between justice and revenge, that justice tells the truth and lets the truth do its work, while revenge needs to stand and watch the wreckage, and that the watching is what makes you smaller in the end than the people you brought down. She let the authorities and the courts do their slow work. She had a name to mend, and it was not Lionel's. Because the clients of Sallow and Hart, the ones who had been sold lies for a decade, did not in the end want the name to die. They wanted it to be true. And there was exactly one Sallow left whom no one in the trade could accuse of complicity, one who had brought the lie down rather than profit from it, one who could read a stone back to the rock that bore it and would never again let a false one pass. The house did not fall. It was taken apart and rebuilt around the only honest thing left in it, and Greta Sallow, who had been handed an iron key and a worthless hill and a non-compete, and shown the door, became, not by inheritance but by the plain force of having been right, the head of the house her grandfather had built. She kept the iron key. She had it set, eventually, behind glass, in the entrance of the rebuilt workshop in Hatton Garden, beside a small brass plate that gave no explanation, because the only people who needed to understand it already did. It was a year later, on a gray afternoon that her grandfather would have loved, that Pernilla Vance came to see the new house and stood with Greta among the benches where the close work was done, and said, after a while, he could have exposed it himself, years ago. He had enough. He had enough, Greta agreed. But he was afraid of rooms. He thought if he stood up, they'd find a way to sit him down, and he was probably right, because he was one frightened old man against a supplier and his own son. So he hid the truth where they'd never look and left it to the one person they'd never watch. She turned a loose stone over in her bench-worn fingers, reading it without thinking, the way she breathed. He was right to be afraid. He was just wrong about one thing. Which was? He thought being underestimated was something that had happened to me, a misfortune, a thing I had to overcome. Greta set the stone down. But it isn't a thing you are. It's a thing other people do. They decide what you're worth, and then they stop looking. And the moment they stop looking, the person they dismissed becomes the one thing in the room they can't account for. Lionel handed me a worthless hill because he was certain I was nothing. And because he was certain I was nothing, he never once imagined I was the only person alive who could walk into that hill and read what was hidden there. She looked around the rebuilt workshop, the honest house, the founder's name made true again. He made my whole life into the perfect hiding place for the truth, and then he handed me the key to it himself. Pernilla was quiet a moment. And now they all know what you're worth. Now they do, Greta said. But that was never the point. She picked up her loupe and held the loose stone up to the cold gray light and read it true. The point is that the lie is finished, and the name means something again, and the next person who buys a stone with that guarantee on it will be buying the truth. My grandfather told me in his last letter to trust the stone, that it doesn't lie even when everyone holding it does. She smiled faintly, the first easy smile in a long while. He wasn't really talking about diamonds. They had all judged her completely wrong, the boardroom, the partners, the laughing cousin, the supplier who called her a grieving spinster who breeds no, who plays at rocks. Every one of them had decided what Greta Sallow was worth, and then stopped paying attention. And the worthless hill in the cold north had turned out, the way the truth so often does, to have been the most important thing in the whole story all along, waiting, behind a century-rusted door, for the one person who knew how to look at it to come and bring what was hidden up into the light.